In this presentation, I'd like to, as briefly as I can, introduce a couple of concepts into what I hope that you're seeing as, on one hand, law's difficulty of dealing with a concept like gender, but also more about what philosophies can be used to consider the relationships among folks within a legal structure. And that's really where I'm hoping your mind will start going for the rest of the semester. So I really intended this to be something that you'd view kind of after you'd explored a little bit. So I think you should be familiar with the concept of heteronormativity. You should be able to see how that particular ideology, while probably okay, I mean, I'm not really a judgmental person, but probably okay in someone's individual family or perhaps even religious establishment, becomes quite problematic in a social arrangement where certain folks, oftentimes straight men, are quite judgmental to the point of using the law as a crime to come after anyone who has a different perspective than they do. And that's where I'm trying to get you to see this ecology of gender. In other words, this ecosystem of why gender even matters. And so this is a kind of ongoing project of mine. And I think you'll see in both the Barnard lectures and the little piece I wrote for when I was teaching at Barnard at Columbia, was that I was trying to help the students there think about, since many of them are coming from positions of privilege, this kind of overlapping relationship among migration, environmentalism, and struggles within the law. And so I want to kind of take that idea and switch it a little bit to focus more on gender so that folks have a better idea of how this kind of begins. So I'm going to just give you two ideas to just think about for a second before I get into the vocabulary and kind of the language that we're going to get into here. But one comes from a French philosopher who's quite well known within gender studies, Michel Foucault from France in roughly the 70s. And I'm just going to read a little bit from his history of sexuality. So, what knowledge was formed as a result of this linkage? The object, in short, is to define the regime of power, knowledge, pleasure that sustains the discourse on human sexuality in our part of the world, meaning the Western part of the world. The central issue then at sexuality in our part of the world, what is this? When he says linkage, what he means is the where knowledge, power, and both the production of pleasure, and prostitution being the most obvious one, but also the subtle and implicit ways that people judge other people's sexuality. So there's kind of both sides of that coin. And what he's saying is, it's not to determine whether one says yes or no to sex, right? We're not talking about compliance, we're not talking about rape in this particular issue. But whether one formulates prohibitions or permissions, whether one asserts its importance or denies its effects, or whether one refines the words one uses to designate it. So in other words, not just about the things that are not allowed, not just about the significance of how people judge the outcome of these events. The Lorena Bobbitt case comes to mind, but also not really the specific language that people are using. So we're not criticizing ways in which people are talking about sexuality and gender, but instead what we're thinking about is a little bit harder to quantify, right? So to account for, but not in like the accounting sense, but more in the to think about and explore the fact that sexuality and gender is spoken about, and so often spoken about, as you saw in Mapplethorpe and Raven, etc. But who is speaking, right? What are the positions and viewpoints from which they are speaking? What institutions do they represent? Where are they situated? How do those institutions prompt people to speak about sex and gender? And really, how does that distribute information about power relationships throughout a different social structure, whether it be your employer, whether it be a school facility, whether it's within your family, etc. And so that's, the big philosophical kind of point that we're looking at, is about like, how does this information spread, and what does that say about our relationships amongst each other, and then with this concept of law as a big kind of broad idea. And then I think, if you are really curious in this information, I think one thing you might look up is a article that I found on JSTOR, which you can access through the Kingsborough Library. It's called "Thinking Flowers?" as Black Ecofeminist Activism. The author is Lauren Craig, Craig. It was written in 2014 in the Feminist Review. And what's fascinating about this, I just want to read one kind of statement from her. But what she set out to do was she set out to create a flower company that would be more ecologically sustainable. But she experienced along the way so much gender discrimination and racial discrimination, and this is in England, but I'm sure it's just as relevant in any other part of the world at this moment. And what she began to see was that there's this kind of global capitalist dominance that really equals white male privilege. And she kind of kept running into this no matter how successful the business was. And she struggled at first, but then she kind of got the business going. It gained a lot of popularity. But in her reflection, she says, however, soon austerity policies and local politics began to crush us. We had to leave Brixton Village as we could not generate enough income for the rental contracts. As popularity increased, so did the rent. At the same time, the cultural and gender diversity decreased. Despite the Grade 2 listing having been achieved precisely to its cultural importance to African and Caribbean history, after that, my studio was housed for 2 years at a different location. Despite its subsequent closure due to more politics, many of us continue to support one another through, for example, our work on Black feminism, on art and therapy, flower and vegetable growing, and heritage work. You see what Foucault was kind of getting at there. On the one hand, this kind of big, broad dominance of power is brought upon, and I think in America we'd call this gentrification, despite the popularity of the company, despite the fact that people had stolen the concept, despite the fact that folks were becoming more and more supportive of this sustainable flower growing company, it couldn't keep up with the larger forces, for lack of a better word, of global capitalism. And so just like gentrification you see in parts of Brooklyn or in Queens, as the rents go up, success of a business is no longer determined by how many customers you have or how good your product is. It becomes, are you able to essentially sell your product and your company to somebody who's already in the power elite, in most cases, white males, and more banks. So operated mostly by white males if you do your research, right? So on the other hand, she's talking about how even though that happened, the process of creating that work she found to be a form of activism that gave her more power, more influence, and continued to support other folks who were trying to do the same thing, and really to start to clarify or self-define, as Patricia Hill Collins referred to in the reading that hopefully you did, what Black feminism means, what art and therapy can be together, and how something as simple as flower and vegetable growing can grow, to use the pun, into something like heritage work, right? Like, where are my roots? Again, to use that reference. And so I want you to think about this, because this is kind of where we're trying to go with law, right? It's got two sides to it. On the one hand, it can be restrictive, it can be prohibitive, but on the other hand, it can be quite empowering. And so we want to think about that as we move forward. So by law, in this presentation, I'm using it as a very abstract kind of concept, as a tool used by social groups. So you could use law, you could use violence, you could use politics in the sense of running for office, you could use social media for that matter as a tool used by social groups to kind of further their ideas of justice and social justice. By ecology, it's similar to the concept within science, in fact, not too different at all, but just placing ourselves within kind of a system of living and non-living things. And I won't just spend too much time on that. In the classroom, we probably talk about that for a couple weeks. Online, I'll let you just kind of ponder that idea that we always obviously live in an interrelationship between living and non-living things. The computer that you're watching this on is clearly not a living thing in our sense of the word, and yet it's incredibly relevant to our positionality right now and to our kind of how we even see ourselves. And whether you're even able to see this, right? That's a whole other kind of issue that describes our ecology. Epistemology is a big word, right? A difficult word, but it's common among academics and scholars and your teachers, and so something you should know. Generally, epistemology, is referred to as epistemologies, right? So if you take a philosophy class and they're talking about Aristotle, oftentimes, they'll talk about, which I'm going to refer to later as the biopolitics, like Foucault talks about, where Aristotle was concerned with the classification of animals, first and foremost. And then later he got into other issues like ethics and politics. Whereas if you thought about, Plato, is thought of as the epistemologist of both metaphysics and then also, and to some extent, utopias, or like this idea of a changing world. And probably likely your influence of philosophy and epistemology comes from some kind of religious or moral code, whether that be that you believe in it or you are anti it. So in other words, it's like kind of the production of knowledge or the way that knowledge is kind of stored or shared, in the same sense that, on Facebook or Instagram that you share knowledge within your network. That's kind of an epistemology of knowledge, depending on what you're sharing, right? It could be an epistemology of sports. It could be an epistemology of fashion. It could be an epistemology of music. It could be really kind of, I hope you get the idea. But what I mean here is the differences in the ways we construct knowledge. So not so much the end product of knowledge, not the thing that we're talking about, but in the ways that we come together. So I go back to social media because it's somewhat interesting. It's also kind of disappointing, but it is potentially unlimited, right? You could connect to pretty much everybody on the planet, provided that they had an internet connection. But if you start to get into the details of social media, you'll see that there's this unwanted intruder, which is the person that's hosting the site itself, right? Whether it's Facebook or Instagram or YouTube, they're providing information about other videos, about advertisement, and possibly about other people. Now I'm thinking about LinkedIn. So that is constructing knowledge, but not in the way that we had intended when we logged in or we signed in, right? We didn't need to know about this product that we probably have no interest in using, and yet there it is. And so the way that was constructed, whether it's an algorithm that is supposed to be tracking you when you're looking on other websites while you're also logged into that one, whether it's guessing, or whether it's using some kind of like mass distributions strategy, like allegedly the Russians used in the 2016 election. This is what I'm mostly interested in. Like, how do these things reach this kind of broader audience, and then how do we define that audience? And then by gender, I mean the socially constructed term, right? I'm not talking about reproductive organs. I'm not talking about reproductive ability. I'm not talking about even really self-defined, right? Like, I'm a man, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about more about how this term has been loosely based in this like Aristotle category of like, separation, right? Duality, for, against, this kind of idea, man, woman. And what does that say about knowledge? Like, how did we make sense of things like gender transition, non-conforming identities, entertainers? I mean, there's just so many different human beings and other categories that don't fit neatly into this box of gender. So that's what I mean. I'm not talking about specific people. I'm talking about this term that people kind of use loosely. So I've come up with a bit of a what would be called a model, right? And so this can be somewhat daunting, but I want you to look at the bottom first and see these 3 blank spaces. I put those on there because, fill in the blanks. Like, you could add to this model. So I'm going to start with kind of the top and then move down, and you might think about, what am I missing? So kind of throughout my research in the last 15 years, it always seems to come back to capitalism. And I thought, after reading someone called Gregory Bateson, he said, you should always look at one category beyond the one that you're looking at. And so I thought, okay, capitalism is a category, but what is it really getting at, right? Okay, it's an economic base of social relations. In other words, it's a relationship that we form in order to produce certain goods and services based on what we think are human needs. So, okay, so what are other ways that we could exist? It could be feudalism, has been in the past. It could be communism. It could be tribalism, right? There's all these different isms, if you're noticing a pattern here. But the one that we're in is capitalism, right? I mean, I don't think anyone denies that. And so capitalism kind of is the economic base of how we form our relations. Normally that's on two principles, right? That there's wage labor, although slavery obviously exists. And then secondly, that there's some kind of market, right? And I think it's getting harder and harder to define that. But if we just imagined Craigslist or eBay, in some ways Amazon, as these somewhat wide open spaces where people come and sell, right? The historical example would have been the bazaar, but obviously in COVID that's become almost impossible, although I do see farmers markets from time to time operating. But the idea that, there's this space that we come and interact, but we're taking on a certain role, right? Whether it's with money, whether it's the person selling, or, as people say, window shopping. So it's just this idea that this is kind of the base. This is the thing that we're all kind of living in. If you're fond of movies, this is the Matrix. There's then, I think one has to think, okay, where did this come from? And largely, I could paint with a big, broad brush here and say roughly in the 1400s, you have a transition from feudalism to capitalism, mainly because of colonialism, the acquisition and redistribution of gold and silver from South and Central America, going back to Spain, the invention of the Atlantic slave trade. You kind of have this, but this is all based on a patriarchy, right? It's all based on strong males and what would be considered to be white at that time, although that's not a skin color reference then, it's more of a cultural reference. In other words, they're Christians. They're from the 1300s to 1400s. They represent lords and knights and, this kind of world that you can watch on TV and see what was like back in those days in the Middle Ages. But, this was like the man is the head of the group. He's the head of the tribe, the family, etc. That's still, we're still in that world, right? Like, so if you look at any random sampling of Fortune 500 companies, they're mostly run by men. Sports, entertainment, you just go through this list and the producers, the directors tend to be men. And so again, I don't think anyone's really going to push back and say, no, you're terribly wrong. So I wanted to just then relate, well, so how does capitalism and patriarchy kind of manifest itself? How does it show itself? Well, I think it's obvious that it's religion, right? And so when we think of quote unquote the white man's religion, I think you should look up this man named Max Weber, depending on how you want to speak, but Weber and the Protestant ethic. This is largely what we're talking about in America. So he also writes a lot about law, but he's writing about in the sense that law is constitutive. In other words, law is the thing that leads people to create something like a constitution or legislation or these other kind of things that you see and call law. But law was the thing that was kind of before. And in my other presentations, you'll see I'm talking about natural law or the philosophy of natural law. And I don't think you need to get caught up in the details here, but how does law as constitutive work itself out? Well, it's the institution of law, right? So that's lawyers, judges, courts, criminal justice, etc. The ideologies of law, whether you think that law should be used for rights to defend yourself, or whether you think law should be used to get everybody to get along, or whether you think law should be used as a harsh punishment, right? That's your ideology. That's your point of view, worldview. And then there's the instrumentalities of law. How does law actually operate within legal circles, right? So the court order, legal opinions, legal writing, etc. And then I have that as kind of separate, right? It's not separate, but it's just visually, I want you to think about it. Those are the things that kind of exist before you're born. Then we're all born into this kind of yellow space, right? So we've got the limitation and constraints. In other words, we're not going to be able to change anything outside of the yellow circle without Well, not at all. I mean, really, you're not going to be able to change anything outside the yellow circle unless you could somehow change these categories that start with this distribution of role power, whether it's parent, child, whether it's rich, poor, right? Whether it's cop, accused, right? Like these are the power roles that manifest themselves in basic social relations. Again, going back to capitalism and patriarchy. So if we think of these just broad terms as gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, citizenship, poverty, elite, middle class, non-conforming, label, these aren't real things, right? I don't go to the store and order one of these things. These are words and phrases that people have come up with as convenience, I suppose, to name things in situations. And so this is what we want to think about role power, right? There's always different actors or different roles that we're taking on. And there's three broad categories that a lot of social science folks have identified as ecological, which can include the economy, but it also includes our biology. You know, we're only going to make difference within the amount of time we're here, for example, given our physical health, our ability to take care of ourselves. But then there's also technological, like the changes in technology might feel great, right? They might feel like, wow, I'm so empowered all of a sudden. But we're also restrained by those things, right? We're constrained by those things. We're limited by those things. We can't do other things because we're doing those things, right? This is always the big trade-off I think people are thinking about. And then there's always the cultural expectations and, you know, punishments, rewards, sideways looks, right? All the labels, all the things that kind of come through cultural factors. And so you want to think about just how, you know, you fit within this yellow circle, and then, you know, what changes you'd make are going to be really dependent on your understanding of those things. And again, those things both kind of inform anything outside the yellow circle, and then they're informed by. So again, you might think of like other things that I haven't included. And then now I want to kind of ground us into law as a set of language, right? And so the 14th Amendment, you know, states pretty clearly, I mean, not pretty clearly, extremely clearly, right, if you look it up, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny with person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of laws. So we just divide it up, right? On one hand, the 14th Amendment provides equal protection, the other is due process. So you should be rightly asking, what's the difference? So equal protection, you know, strangely enough, is the harder part. I'd say strangely enough because if I look at it, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of laws. How can that be difficult? The difficulty is that you have to show that you're of a protected group. So, you know, let's say that someone sued the president of our university at Kingsborough for hiring a certain kind of person and not hiring a different kind of person. The only way that you could win in a lawsuit like that is if you are protected, you're from a protected group. So oddly enough, you'd be saying you've been discriminated and harmed because you're a minority by a minority for hiring other minorities. So this has what's called a balancing test. So it says, you know, is this claim that you're making compelling, right? Have you provided a compelling case? So I think it would be very difficult to win that case. I might even go out on a limb and say this is a dead on arrival case. But somebody could bring it, right? But you can see the challenges that one might face when trying to bring that particular claim of equal protection. It doesn't mean generally, you know, you hear this ridiculous phrase, reverse discrimination. As a white male of privilege, I find that to be insane. There's no such thing as reverse discrimination. There's no such thing as a white person being, you know, harmed by a decision, right? Because we're not talking about individuals. We're not talking about Jason. We're not talking about Donald Trump. We're talking about the whole group of white people. So as long as white people hold all those powerful positions, one white person not getting hired somewhere is not a terrible discrimination and harm. On the other hand, right, that same person, so it's not discrimination in other words, but that same person might have a claim in due process. And ordinarily, people bring due process claims under procedure, and that's what you see over here is, you know, apparently you can have your life, liberty, and property taken away from you as long as there's a process. Now, the underlying joke there would be, you know, what kind of process would be fair that takes away your life, liberty, or property. But I can give you 3 right off the top of my head, right? The deprivation of life is called the death sentence, right? The deprivation of liberty is called putting you in jail, and the deprivation of property is called either eviction if you're renting, or eminent domain if you own a home. So, there are processes in which the courts, right? Remember, this is the instrumentalities of law, have deemed proper. On the other hand, there are what are called substantive fundamental human rights, and these can never be taken away. And I say that, like, when I say never be taken away, legally, right? So I'll throw out a very political statement that, what Donald Trump and Homeland Security have done at the border with migration, largely refugees, is clearly a violation of the 14th Amendment. But it will take years and years and years. I mean, it took 20 plus years to get Brown versus Board of Education to the Supreme Court. So it'll take years and years and years to get a statement of law on that fact. But any expert within immigration law would tell you that this is, blatant violation of the 14th Amendment. And I think he and his lawyers know that. But they figure, they're there 4 years, maybe 8 years, and so they can get away with it. And that really comes to the end of my presentation. I was like, see what these men are doing. And there can be women and minorities that work in the administration, but try to remember who's at the top of the pyramid, right? I think that also goes to the questions of complicity and what people would do. And so this is tough, right? The 14th Amendment seems to be quite, protective in words, but then when you get into the practice of it, when you get into the process of it, you see it's not quite as clear. And I think that probably came through in the abortion cases or the reproductive rights cases. And I think it also probably came through in, like, how much a clerk for Justice Ginsburg has to do. And then I might just, conclude this slide by saying it would be a good idea to do more research on Justice Sotomayor, including in the reader at the end. She talks about why, right, women of color in particular have to work harder. That's not a they should work harder statement. That's a reality, right? Within this kind of white supremacist world, women of color have to work harder in order to, quote unquote, right, quote unquote, be equal. And so you kind of see how this is kind of working in the law. Now, I want to, push us towards a happy ending then. So what are the factors of change? How could people, make change? Well, I think what I'm hoping you've accomplished over this time in your own research is that knowledge of capitalism proves that industrialists and bankers require a surplus of potential laborers in order to keep costs, wages, and benefits stable. Now somebody says, whoa, Jason, that's terrible you're saying this. What? No, this comes from Wall Street. This is what investment bankers know. This is what any MBA would know, right? I'm not saying anything political here. I'm saying, like, in order for capitalism to exist and be successful, there has to be stability in the sense of keeping wages and benefits as low as possible. And so this should then lead you to a political position, which is that knowledge of law then proves that property interests are protected based on an economics of predictability. In other words, the courts have, at least since the 1930s, sided on behalf of banks, major corporations, and wealthy elites simply from an economics of predictability. In other words, they're so afraid of capitalism failing that they're willing to upend the entire social system. But this shouldn't be surprising if we understand that the ecology of social relations has, at least for 400 years, allowed for men, and in particular white privileged elites and those who kind of go along with those quote-unquote, I can't remember exactly, there's boardroom boys, there's locker room talk, right? There's all these different phrases. But, you can go along with it, right? You can pretend, you can assimilate, etc. But they're the ones who create the rules of the game, so to speak, right? They're the ones who enforce the system. And again, this is largely based simply in economics, right? So it's strange when you try to veer too far from the economic basis of, say, policing. So defund the police is an interesting concept at the moment, right? Because I think you could take a feminist perspective that this is going to be damaging to women who are trying, domestic violence cases, sexual assault, etc. But on the other hand, that, you should, if that's your position, you should be doing your research on how many police sexually assault women. And so I think this is what I mean. Like, as long as men are the ones making the rules of the game, who gets to challenge them? Who gets to challenge, what justice looks like, or even how much money we spend, goes back into this economics kind of point of view. And again, because of capitalism. So if we were in a different economic system, as I think anyone from the Soviet Union, or former Soviet Union, I should say at this point, you would understand, right? I think you'd get it. Like, there's a different set of rules. They could be similar, right? But the way that they're enforced is different. But again, it goes back to this economic base of relations. So again, I'm not taking sides on the economic system. I'm not, I would love for people to think more about it, and we could come up with a new idea. But I don't think that we can look to the past to come up with a new idea. And I think if you wanted to do more research on this, Angela Davis is asking interesting questions and has for a long time. So you could think more about this. But this leads to this kind of point I'm trying to make, which is the epistemology, right? The knowledges of power, logically, would be constrained by those three things, right? In other words, you can't make dramatic change in America without changing the economy. You couldn't make dramatic change to the economy without changing the culture. And you couldn't change the culture without a change in technology. So until those three things happen, you have white heteronormative supremacy, right? That is the dominant narrative. That is the dominant cultural, ecological, economic, and technological narrative. I think the idea, right, you to pick on one person, I might even pick on more than one, but to pick on one person would be Mark Zuckerberg. It's quote unquote inventing Facebook, which is insane. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? Do some research other than watch the movie, which there you go. There's the cultural representation of technology in an economic form to confirm white heterosupremacy. I think, you'd have to do a lot of research, though, going back for 50, 60 years on what is the technology he developed with other people, and how his male status at Harvard allowed him to do so. You could apply this to a lot of different people, Bill Gates, etc. The idea is that's the situation, that's the matrix, that's the world we live in. So then how do we change that world? Well, I'm presenting different ideas here. So let's look at some of these pictures before I get into the big words that I hope that you learn throughout the semester. So I think, one thing one experience I have is, from students. So two of the pictures are represented here are ones that students brought to my attention. On the one hand, a global representation of ecology and law, right? So that there are interesting perspectives on the human experience and especially how law is applied in different environments. And that's very true of Kingsborough. And you can almost hear my sadness in that, I can't do something like the urban farm, or even see you, right, face to face, and get these experiences and get these stories. I'm trying as best as I can, and I hope that you'll provide them, and that we've developed that kind of trust. But that's a change in social relations, right? And so I think the way that knowledge is being shared there is so fundamentally fascinating. And then on the other hand, right, I have reproductions of, let's say, culture as it is, but then shared in a different way. And so the drawing comes from a reimagining of what a hero would look like in a ecological, right, environmental disaster video game that we were working on a few semesters ago. And so just that question itself really changes the paradigm, really kind of shifts it towards different ways of thinking about how law could be used in a less gender-specific way, because the information is being changed. But then I want to think about maybe these three ideas that I'm hoping that you'll start to really think about when you think about law. So the institution of law. Well, that depends on whether you're looking at natural law, which was much more popular before the Civil War for hundreds of years. And it still exists, of course, and much more so in philosophy. Especially in philosophies of folks who have migrated from other countries and come to the United States. Natural law and human rights law, are very much brother and sister, or sister and sister, and they're very much of a family resemblance, if you think about it that way. Whereas positivism is a very strange concept to me personally, but it's highly popular, and it kind of starts with naive ideas of that if I just pass a law, if I just write something a certain way, everybody will understand it and they'll all be good. Whatever I'm defining as good. And obviously, I'm very much reducing that to a very simple narrative, but I think that's fair. And if you think that positivism could be more than that, I'd love to hear from you. But they're going to have different norms, different rules, and a different set of expectations depending on which view of the institution of law you're taking. And natural law and religion have always gone together. So if you're a religious person, you're probably going to see it through a natural law point of view. Positivism tends to conflict with religion, largely because the commands are different, right? So if you were to take like the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill a member of your own tribe, whereas murder in the United States is an intentional killing with malice aforethought. So it's like those aren't the same thing. So you kind of see there's going to be different expectations, there's going to be different applications. And then the ideologies of law, right? How people think about law. So there's, a command, it could be a right, it could be a third way, right? Which is called a nomos in the Greek literature, which is an alternative vision of the future. So we would make laws together or make rules. And if you think that's crazy, ask a child what they think about rules and get them to start talking about rules for 15, 20 minutes. And you can make rules with them and they're quite fond of doing it. And so this is what we mean by the nomos, is that we can make rules together. Basketball, pickup games, make rules up together. So there are lots of, the rules of fashion. There's so many different examples that are popping into my head right now that we constantly do this, but we kind of forget and we put it off in the background. And then there's the instrumentalities of law. And these deal with the constraints within those three elements, right? The eco-cultural, techno-social realities. But there's also the production of relations through dominance, resistance, and compliance. So I purposefully picked AOC here because she has become such a firebrand within conservative Republican circles. I took a road trip this summer across the Bible Belt into the Pacific Northwest, and it was amazing to me, coming from a fairly liberal, progressive social network in New York. Conservatives are infatuated with her, terrified of her, and infatuated with her. I don't think I'd seen 2 or 3 stories about her in New York in my social circles. I must have seen 20 going across the country. I mean, and most of them are completely off topic, nowhere near what she's talking about. But I wanted to grab this picture because this is her before a speech, and this is, let's say, the complexity of gender, right? I mean, she obviously knows the gender expectations that have been given to her in the same way that Sotomayor and Ginsburg do. But she's also performing in this moment, right? She's using Instagram. She's using millennial tactics, right? She's using these instrumentalities to create a third way, to create a new ideology. And I think there is a linking of natural law and kind of this new way of thinking. And I think if you were to look at the Green New Deal, you'd see what I mean. So I want to conclude by just saying the differences in choices, patterns of behavior, and new group identity formation will be the difference, right? It'll be those differences that will make the difference in dynamic change studies. So we will see this as more and more academics look at this, as more and more students look at this, and as more and more social change makers, whether it's on Instagram or whether it's in to be blunt, right here in real life, in the Black Lives Matters movement, in feminist movements like the Women March. I think we will want to study these elements, and those elements being the ecology, the technology, and the cultural aspects of white male supremacy. If we expect change to occur, it's going to have to occur there. Now, am I expecting white males of power to change? I don't think it's impossible. I'm not expecting it, but I do think that it is still the focus of what would be gender and law and power. Um, I think that would be a mistake not to spend some time at least deconstructing those ideas. And then, this is going to lead to a better viewpoint, I think, of human needs of care as we start to think about what is a good, right? What is a good design? What should be the ecological epistemology of social relations? And that could apply to gender, race, ethnicity, or poverty and justices. But I've been focused on gender with this group because I think I should be careful how I say this, but what I mean to say is that in my experience, the overlapping study of gender and ecology, right, environmental issues, is so blatantly obvious about who should be held accountable under a rule of law for injustices. And it's so clear within white male supremacy that the discard for gender and ecology, is not even something that is hidden. So I think that's where, when Foucault was talking about the refusal, blockage, invalidation, and incitement intensification, these techniques of power can be seen from multiple points of view, and that's what I'm hoping you're able to do, to see both the way that language is produced about social change, law, and power, but also about the effects of power, especially as it comes to gender, right? As a category and a concept, I think you see that gender is becoming less and less powerful, right? In the sense of prohibition. But on the other hand, it's becoming a tool for self-definition. So I think I'll stop there and hope that this makes sense. But of course, I'd love to hear more from you.